In transgender care news, and we can't hack off the bits of the minors because, that's bad. An appeal court has let Kentucky enforce a ban on so called transgender care for the minors because, minors need to be protected, and having them undergo these treatments, which are often permanent or lead to significant health repercussions and also are confusing in their own right, we should prevent the minors from doing it. So in appeal courts like Kentucky, you can ban the minors from undergoing the sterilization procedures. That sounds good. Let's get started with this. A federal appeal court is allowing Kentucky to enforce its recently enacted ban on so-called gender-affirming care for young transgender people while the issue is being litigated. The 2-1 decision from the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals was not unexpected. The same three-circuit judge panel ruled the same way earlier this month in a similar case in Tennessee. Interesting, incidentally, that it was the same three judges. That's a bit unusual. I don't know why that was. Maybe they consolidated it because they were related. So the fact that it's the same judges twice is a bit unusual, but not unheard of because, they are closely related matters, so judicial efficiency and all, but okay. So in both Tennessee and Kentucky, these laws are allowed to go forward. The Kentucky law, which was enacted over the veto of the Democratic governor, so shows you just how pissed the legislature is because you need a supermajority. So the governor's all like, nah, and the legislature's all like, yeah. So that's how pissed they are about it. Prevented transgender minors from accessing puberty blockers and hormone therapies, which can often be permanent or lead to permanent ramifications or other serious health effects. They are not, as it says, free. You can't just take them and have no consequences to people's health. At least 20 states have now enacted laws restricting or banning gender-affirming care, or as we might call it on our side of the aisle, barbarousness against youth and sterilization procedures and hideous experimentation like the Isle of Dr. Moreau or something. So that's what we're trying to do. Most of these states have filed lawsuits. A 3-judge panel struck down Arkansas's ban as unconstitutional. In other states, judges have issued disparate rulings on whether laws can be enforced while cases are being litigated, which to some degree will turn on the particularities of these state laws, because obviously it should go without saying that not every state has passed the same law or even or comparable versions of law. So are all of them necessarily legal? I don't know. I'm not an expert in every single state's law about the details. So you might be able to completely logically say that some of them are legal and some of them are not, depending on the details. Because, of course, in law, the details matter. So it could be because the state laws are legal sometimes and not others, or it could be because some judges are full of it. But it's not really sure which of those two you're in the first instance, merely from the disparate results. You'd have to get into the details. In Kentucky, the U.S. District Judge had initially blocked Kentucky from enforcing the ban. So Kentucky, you can't have your ban. But he lifted the injunction after the Sixth Circuit issued its ruling in Tennessee because he could see the writing on the wall. So the district judge initially is like, Kentucky can't enforce their law, but the Sixth Circuit is all like, they totally can. 7 transgender children and their parents had sued to block the law. They argued it violated their constitutional rights and interferes with parental right to seek established medical treatment from their children. Well, that last part is a bit challenging. That's established medical treatment. This is all extremely experimental at best, right? Despite what the AMA or anyone else would have us believe, this is all incredibly novel treatments. And these drugs were often used for chemical castration of sex offender victims. We're using the same drugs in some instances for the sex offenders as for the children. And when you're dealing with children which are developing and their bodies are still developing, the fact that you're causing interference with the natural biological process can cause serious and potentially long-lasting consequences. So you can't necessarily just give the drugs and remove them with no consequence to the child. So all that. So established medical treatment sounds like some bullshit. Also, the state, as a matter of its own police power, which is the general power to do stuff, generally has the power to control medical treatment as well as anything else. So at determining what a valid medical treatment is to some degree necessarily and unavoidably in the hand of the state. It is not just up to the doctors. The doctor may have all kinds of interesting ideas, but the state is the one that issues the licenses, and they're the ones that get to decide what is and is not valid medical practice within their jurisdiction, no matter what a doctor thinks, because there's some doctors who think some crazy ass shit. So the state's all over here like, nah, which seems like a decision the state can make. In Monday's ruling, the judges said the issues in the Kentucky case are essentially identical to those in Tennessee. So that whole thing I was talking about earlier, where we're dealing with 20 different states, and maybe some of them are legal and some of them not, with respect to specifically Kentucky and Tennessee, they are close enough that we don't need to split the difference. So with respect to their particular laws, they are essentially identical. So there is no disparate feature between those two. So therefore, the same rule should apply. Thus, that brings us to the end of the coverage for the moment of about an appeal court, the Sixth Circuit, saying that Kentucky and also Tennessee's ban on transgender therapies for the minors can go into effect, because a lot of this thing is very experimental and very, very scary and shouldn't be allowed. And so they're like, yep, the state has the ability to determine this because they have the ability to regulate medicine just as they ever did. And they think this is not valid medical treatment. And so they're like, no, this is a constitutional right to this, which no. I mean, parents generally have the ability to raise their children, to be sure. But when it comes to medicine specifically, right, and the practice of medicine, that's always been regulated by the state under police powers. So just because a parent wants it, just because the child wants it, which is debatable that child can want any of this stuff, by the way, because they're under the age of majority to make such decisions, just because the doctor wants it doesn't necessarily mean it should be legal. So the state's all over here like, nah. And so the state is allowed to make its choice as it does, as like Tennessee has as well. And that for the moment brings us to the end of discussion of this story.